I've muted people. Again, please don't be shy to unmute yourself. If you unmute yourself and say something, gives me an opportunity to have a rest. So I'm not at all disturbed by it. Well, the topic we've been dealing with in recent weeks, we've been laboring on this unusual halacha, as we called it, of the Arava ceremony. The Gemara is going to look at a different aspect of it today. Really quite interesting historic Gemara. Even at the last counting, after several weeks, it seemed we hadn't completely, with 100% certainty, identified what the nature of the Arava ceremony was, even in the Beis HaMikdash. And you remember there were perhaps two possibilities. One possibility was simply that these large Aravot that were taken from Moza outside Jerusalem were stood up against the sides of the Mizbeach each day in the Beis HaMikdash by the Kohanim. And that was the ceremony, just standing them up to overhang the top of the Mizbeach. Or there was a possibility that it included also carrying the Arava around in Hakafot, around the Mizbeach. And that's a little bit more like what we do when we do our Hoshanas, and we go around with our Lulav and Esrig, and we, and particularly on Hoshana Rabbah, when we do it 7 times. So there was still some remaining doubt. But there was some ritual that took place in the Beis HaMikdash with this very large set of Aravot, which was called the Arava ceremony. Now, when we discussed it, or shall we say, when we first mentioned it, we hadn't discussed the sources in great detail, why this came about. But there is a view that it can be learned from a pasuk in the Torah. This Arava ceremony was rather a dubious drasha. In other words, it was a difficult drasha. But according to one of the Chachamim, it's learned out from a pasuk, which would suggest that the Arava ceremony, remember what I mean, this is not the Arava that's within your lulav, this separate Arava ceremony, which was carried out originally by the Kohanim only, but that ceremony is min haTorah, and that it arises or can be deduced from a verse in the Torah, which means it has Torah standing. It has Torah pedigree, which places the mitzvah at a very high level. Not just someone decided to make this as a custom because it was attractive, but it's actually a Torah ceremony. However, the most common interpretation in terms of source was that this is a halacha Moshe Sinai, and that's the one we mentioned on a number of occasions, that this ritual, even though we don't know exactly what it was a halacha Moshe Sinai. It was a Sinaitic tradition, which came down in parallel with the Luchot from Har Sinai, and was passed on from generation to generation as a tradition by word of mouth. But it carries also, even as Halacha Moshe Sinai reminded you, but also carries Torah force, because it's a Sinaitic tradition, not a much later tradition. It carries Torah force, even though it may not be deducible from a verse in the Torah. It can still carry Torah force if it is Halacha Moshe Sinai. Just 1 second, I'm just going to close the door behind me. I can hear myself echoing. Okay, with you again. However, here we now are coming to the Gemara that actually discusses the source. We may have mentioned to it en passant before on several occasions, but this is the piece of Gemara that really discusses the source for this mitzvah of the Arava. And as we will see, it is a machlokes, and it's quite a baffling machlokes. Here we have, we move into the territory, having already identified that the ritual itself is in some doubt. Exactly what was the ritual? Different versions, different views. We will see there is just as much bafflement about where this particular mitzvah comes from. So altogether, this whole thing with the Arava is somewhat mired in obscurity, really, in terms of its essence and its source. So here, let's see the discussion inside. And I'm going to take you to your Gemara on Mem Daled Amud Aleph 44a, And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think it's 11 lines from the bottom. The first word on that line is bitmimim, and that's from the old subject that we're dealing with last week. Now the Gemara starts with Itmar. Itmar Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. This is what we will be now discussing, that there is a discussion, if you like, which carries a machlokus between these two sages, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, two early Amoraim who were living in Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara says the following: Chad Omar Aravahu Yisod Neviim, V'chad Omar Arava Minhag Neviim. And this is a very unusual machlokus. Very often when the Gemara says min nolan, how do we know a particular halacha? Then the Gemara discusses, is it midrabanan? Is it min haTorah? But over here we find a completely different machlokus, and we don't find halacha l'moshe v'sinai mentioned at all at this point. We find here a machlokus about the origin of Arava, but it's only one of two options. One is that it may be a Yesod Nevi'im, and the other one is that it may be a Minhag Nevi'im. Which Nevi'im are we talking about? So Rashi says we're talking about the first Nevi'im at the time of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, who came in, if you like, roughly at around the time of Ezra, to build up Eretz Yisrael again. They were the people who were Olei Bovel. They came back and they rebuilt the Beis HaMikdash, and in if you like, a minor and rather pale form, they tried to rebuild the state of Eretz Yisrael. So it's that first generation, about 2,300, 2,400 years ago. Those Nevi'im, Chagi, Sacharia, Malachi. And what's the machlokus? There's a machlokus whether it is a Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im. Let me just share my screen. 1 second. So I've placed the alternatives here, Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im. And I've also said, always at halacha l'moshe v'sinai. We actually have three options. But over here, this machlokus, for the moment, doesn't deal with this third one that we've been so prone to mention. But it's either Yesod or a Minhag. Now, what's the difference between a Yesod and a Minhag? This is something that the Nevi'im introduced. There's no machlokus here between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi on this point. But did they introduce it as a Yesod, or did they introduce it as a Minhag? And like everything else on this piece of Gemara, even the Mefarshim can't agree as to what the difference between these two are. It's almost the only time you get this sort of discussion in the Gemara. Now, a minhag is something we generally understand. That's a word you're used to seeing. It's a minhag, you say. Well, sometimes a minhag is taken very lightly. Be very careful. The word minhag can sometimes carry a lot of weight. It isn't always something that we say, it's our minhag to always wear a black hat on when we go to shul on a Friday night. You can say that's your minhag. That's not what we mean here by a minhag. A minhag over here is something which has had long standing and has been accepted as being weighty in some way. And the Jewish people have taken upon themselves to carry out. It's a custom, but a custom that carries some force and ancient tradition. That's the type of minhag we're talking about. And the Nevi'im brought that minhag in. Now, there's a machlokes Rashi and other Mefarshim. How did they actually bring that minhag in? I'm dealing with this minhag Nevi'im first, because that's, in a sense, the easier one. And Rashi says, when it's a minhag Nevi'im, Rashi's actually, in a sense, clearer in his distinction between minhag and Yesod. He said, when it says a minhag Nevi'im, it means that the Nevi'im brought it in, but they never insisted that it should become widespread. They had no source for it. They got up one day, the Nevi'im, and they have Ruach HaKodesh, they have Siyata D'Shmaya, whatever, and they had a vision that they should bring in of this minute of this ceremony, which we haven't even been 100% sure what it is, of the Arava, into the Beis HaMikdash. But they didn't say, we're introducing this, Lenetzach Le'olam Voed, that this is an eternal new minute we bring in, rather that we think that it would be nice in this generation, and we're coming back from Bovel, let's do something very nice during the 7 days of Sukkot. Let's erect these huge aravos against the side of the Mizbeach. Why, we don't know, but let's say that was their minhag. They brought that minhag in, but it wasn't meant to be instituted as a permanent procedure in the Beis Hamikdash. It was a custom, and a temporary custom perhaps only, while they were around. It was a minhag neviim. And the other source says it's Yesod Nevi'im. Now, Yesod Nevi'im would be a stronger version of it. That means like a takana. It is a rule. It was instituted into the law books. That's stronger than a minhag. That's much stronger. And Yesod carries eternal force. It would be something that would have to be done forever. And it would be a rule and not just a custom. So this machlokes here as to whether the arava ceremony, whatever it is, was brought in as a yesod, which is a takana, which carries greater force, or a minhag, which carries lesser force. Now, the Meforshim asked at the end of the day, what's the difference, lamaisa? What difference does it make to you or me? You know, we do it. You know, do we do something? We say it's a minhag, it's yesod. In both these cases, we're saying the Nevi'im introduced it. We're not saying one's min HaTorah, one's Drabonon. So what essentially separates between the two in terms of the way in which we should relate to them? So the Mefarshim say there is actually quite an important essential difference. If you say that this institution of Nevi'im was in the form of yesod, then it would carry with it a bracha to precede it. You'd make a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu olam ha'sheket sham tzfanu al mitzvahs arava. For example, I made up a bracha. Maybe that would be the right bracha. That would be the bracha that the Kohanim would have said when they did it. Why? Because it's an instituted, it carries with it a din drabonon, just like on Hanukkah. When we light the menorah, it's not a Torah mitzvah, we make brachas. So, and before we read the Megillah, not a Torah mitzvah, we make brachas. A bracha doesn't have to be on something, on a mitzvah which is min Torah. Similarly, when the Nevi'im institute something, and this becomes a little bit like Neiros Hanukkah, and it would merit a bracha. That's if it's a Yesod Nevi'im. However, the opinion that says a minhag Nevi'im puts it at a lower level. And before a minhag Nevi'im, then there wouldn't necessarily be a bracha. It would just be carried out as a ritual. With a Yesod, if it were a Yesod, there would definitely need to be a full bracha. And if it were a minhag, there wouldn't necessarily. Now, even this is not so clear, because actually what we do on Rosh Chodesh, when we say Hallel, in Ashkenaz at least, we make a bracha. And now that's supposed to be a minhag. So there are brachas, there are even situations where we'd say a bracha on a minhag. So this becomes even more excruciating. Nevertheless, in principle, a Yesod would always carry a bracha because it would be like a mitzvah derabanan, whereas a minhag is not quite at the level of mitzvah, and even though you might carry out the ritual, it wouldn't need a preceding bracha. That's the way the Mefarshim would see the difference between the two. Okay, still a little bit strange, but that would be the origin. Remember, not min Torah wouldn't carry Torah force. In terms of making a bracha, I just brought this important set of psukim over here. Even if you say this is a yesod to Nevi'im, and therefore it carries the weight of a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, how do you know you make a bracha? Because we say, and this is the famous posuk in Shoftim, al pi al Torah asher yarucha, v'al hamishpat asher yomer lecha, whatever the sages tell you to do as an instruction, lo sosum adav asher yidu lecha yominu smel. You should not go to the right or the left. You have to follow what the rabbis say. And this is the origin for saying that even a mitzvah d'Rabbanan carries Torah weight. It's a very important principle. It's this is very confusing. We don't mean that every mitzvah d'Rabbanan is min HaTorah. It isn't. The Torah didn't say do the arava, light a menorah. But the Torah did say listen to what the Chachamim instruct you to do in every generation. And if the Chachamim make a mitzvah to light d'Rabbanan, then they're doing so with the authority of the Torah, and therefore indirectly it's a mitzvah which you can say this is a real mitzvah and make a bracha on it. But that's only if it's a yesod. If this case of a rava were a yesod, it would carry the weight of a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. But if it was a minhag, it wouldn't carry the weight of a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Okay. So having made that introduction, I just brought this in the form of a machlokus, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, in terms of whether it's a yesod nevi'im or a minhag nevi'im. But the Gemara didn't say who said what. And very often the Gemara in line with the advice in Pirkei Avos, you should always say every statement b'shem omro. If you know who said what, did Rabbi Yochanan say it was Yisod Nevi'im, or was it Rabbi Yisrael ben Levi? Let's try and find it. It's not good enough just to say we know there was a machlokus, but we don't know who said what. Sometimes we're in that situation, but where we can resolve it, the Gemara likes to do so they can attribute the opinions to their respective owners, so to speak. So we really know the MS. So therefore, the Gemara comes now with a statement in which it wishes to prove who said what. So the Gemara says simply, Tistayem, let it be possible to prove, the Rabbi Yochanan hu da'amar Yesod Nevi'im, that this first opinion of Yesod Nevi'im is Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore this one of Minhag Nevi'im is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. How can we prove that is the case? So says the Gemara, because the Amar Rabbi Abahu, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Abahu was a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan, and he once made a statement in the name of his Rav, Rabbi Yochanan, and the statement was this: Harava Yesod Nevi'im hu. Very straightforward. But Harava is Yesod Nevi'im. So in other words, Rabbi Yochanan is actually quoted by his Talmud as saying that the Harava is the stronger form. It is actually like a mitzvah drabonim. It's a Yesod Nevi'im. And therefore that proves that he must be the author of that statement. So even though before we had a statement which it wasn't explained who said what, we do know from a statement of his Talmud, Rabbi Abahu, that he was the author of Yesod Nevi'im, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said Minhag Nevi'im. And the Gemara says, Tistayem, yes, let that indeed prove the case. Let it rest at this point that Rabbi Yochanan held the mitzvah of Arava to be a Yesod Nevi'im. But now the Gemara is actually going to challenge this from a brisa that we mentioned much earlier on, or an amira that we mentioned much earlier on. We have just now attributed, it seems, the statement of Yesod Nevi'im, that it is an institution instructed by the Nevi'im to Rabbi Yochanan. Says the Gemara, is that really the case? We just quit sharing. Is that really the case? Amalei Rabbi Zer and Rabbi Avahu. Rabbi Avahu was attributed as being the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan to say that his Rebbe said that Arava is Yesod Nevi'im. So said Rabbi Zer to Rabbi Avahu, what do you mean? That you heard your Rebbe say, Rabbi Yochanan say, that Arava was a Yesod Nevi'im. Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. Is it possible that Rabbi Yochanan could have said what you say he said, that it's a Yesod Nevi'im? Surely not. V'Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yenechunya Ish Bikas Beis Chorton. This is what we mentioned last week. Did not Rabbi Yochanan say in the name of Rabbi Nechunya Ish Bikat Beit Chorton? This is where he came from. That what? Esanitius, Arava, the Nisoch Hamayim, Halacha LaMoshe MiSinai. It was one of those three cases. Remember, we discussed those three cases, particularly the case of Esanitius and those trees that were planted before the Shemitah, and they needed to have the soil around them loosened, etc., and what the rules were about doing pre-Shemitah work, depending upon the area in which 10 trees were planted. But it was one of three cases, Rabbi Yochanan said, where was a halacha l'Moshe MiSinai, and the middle one was Arava. So it seems that Rabbi Yochanan was attributed as saying elsewhere that the mitzvah Arava is halacha l'Moshe MiSinai. Now, Arava cannot both at the same time be a halacha l'Moshe MiSinai and a Yesod Nevi'im. Those are two completely different forms of source. Yesod Nevi'im, as we said, is an instruction given by the latter Nevi'im when they came into Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the country after Dolus Bavel. They instituted this, according to Yesod Nevi'im, they instituted this mitzvah of Arava, whereas Halacha LaMoshe MiSinai takes it back 1,000 years earlier to Har Sinai and says that it emanates from Har Sinai and carries Torah force. Whereas the Yesod Nevi'im, anyway, would only carry a mitzvah drabonon force. So those are two very different statements, and Rabbi Yochanan cannot have said both. So and this is a question being raised against Rabbi Abahu, who said that he heard Rabbi Yochanan say it was Yesod Nevi'im, and we have a statement over here in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that he said it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And this question is put to Rabbi Avahu, because it's Rabbi Avahu who made the statement that it was Yisod Nevi'im. And he's presented with another statement that the Arava is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So how is Rabbi Avahu going to answer this question? Did he mishear? Did he forget? Has he made a mistake? Or did Rabbi Yochanan change his mind? He has to come up with an answer now because he's being asked to explain himself. There is another statement that says it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, also in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says something very cute over here. The Gemara says, Eshtomein b'sho'a k'sho'a chada. Rabbi Avahu was so struck dumb by this question, he remained silent for a complete hour. So he and Rabbi Zera were seated at the Beis HaMidrash. Rabbi Zera had asked this question, saying, how can you say it is a Yisod Nevi'im? He's quoted authoritatively elsewhere as saying it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So Rabbi Avahu is supposed to answer that question. So he sits for an hour, completely tongue-tied. He doesn't know what to say. He can't figure out an answer for this. It's interesting, this expression, eshtomem k'sho'a chada, which means to be baffled and dismayed and silent for an hour, is actually an extract of a pasuk in Sefer Daniel, where it says Daniel was eshtomem k'sho'a chada. 1 second, something's just appeared on my screen. And okay, it's gone. No, it's doing certain things, it's scanning. I'll get rid of it. Okay, these things happen sometimes. Computers are like living organisms. Even though you think you have them under control, every now and again they go through all sorts of strange cleaning up processes, and then they issue messages on screen just to distract you. So anyway, it seems the same over here. Rabbi Avahu is perplexed. He knows that he's right, that Rabbi Yochanan did say it was a Yisod Nevi'im, but he also knows that it's right that he said that it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So how do you reconcile two opposites? And he does say after 1 hour, it's like a chess match. You've seen, they said, there's some cases of chess where someone suddenly carries out a move which baffles the other side, and they're on the clock. And it's I think I'm not sure what the record is, 48 minutes or something like that. Where these chess players usually take 4 minutes to move because they're timed, and 48 minutes to decide what to do. Do you take what seems to be his gambit? He's offering you his knight. He must be offering you his knight for a reason. So you know there has to be a response to this, but you just don't know what it is. So he finally responds with a brilliant piece of maneuvering. You can see how long it took him to put this together. So let me first translate it. So he said, I'll tell you how to reconcile this. He says, Va'omar, and he responded, Shachachum. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which was the original source, was forgotten. The Yisodum, the Chozru v'Yisodum, and the Nevi'im, when they came back to Eretz Yisrael, they re-established the mitzvah of Arava as a Yisod Nevi'im. So you can have it both. You can have it both ways. So what is he saying over here? First, he's making a statement which is very daring, because he's essentially saying that something that was halacha l'Moshe Sinai was forgotten over time. And he would suggest it was because of the Golus Bavel. After the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, given all the upheavals that takes place then, and the Bnei Yisrael are taken into Bavel, and they're in foreign soil, and they have no Beis HaMikdash. And they may be not having a written tradition of halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There were 1 or 2 little rules on the side that got forgotten. So this halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which was anyway, we can see wasn't particularly well chronicled because we don't even know what it was forgotten. When they came back into Eretz Yisrael, the Olei Bavel who came back, they tried to reconstruct what had been forgotten in Bavel. And this is one of those things that had to be reconstructed. And they reconstructed this din of the Arava, which originally had Torah force, and they brought it in as a Yisod Nevi'im because it had been forgotten. They remembered it, or they had Ruach HaKodesh, or whatever it is, they were able to reinstitute it to the Beis HaMikdash after the Beis HaMikdash was rebuilt following the return from Bavel. That is his answer over here. So he's had his cake and he's eaten it over here. Both statements are true. The statement that says it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai is true. Originally, it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The statement that he heard in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it is a Yesod Nevi'im is also true, because when you forget something and it needs to be reintroduced into the law books in some way, it is reinstituted and it comes in as a takana of a Nevi'im, and they're both right. Okay, the Gemara is going to attack this notion now. It's going to get very interesting. The Gemara is going to attack this notion that it's possible to say that because of the Golos Bovel, this halacha l'Moshe Sinai could have been forgotten. That in some way, the traditions that were with them at the time of the Chorban Habayis were gradually lost as they entered the exile, and therefore, during the time in Bovel, if you like, the information that they carried with them began to become eroded. And as a result of that erosion, they lost this memory of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But not just this, possibly hundreds of other things as well. This is only meant to be an example. He's not saying there was only one thing that was ever forgotten in Bovel. He's made a point, Rabbi Zera, that there was forgetfulness as a result of the traumatic experiences of the exile in Bovel. There was forgetfulness. And therefore, what came back into Eretz Israel needed to be reconstructed in a sense. And maybe that's what happens when you go through a golus and an exile. You lose your records, you lose your photographs, you lose your furniture, you lose your money, and you lose your memories. And over here, even halacha and even Torah can be lost as well. So that's coming through here.
Can I ask a question? But that can be used as a tool, can't it, for all kinds of things? You can extend that as a generalization.
Yeah, what as for what?
Say something was, well, you make it a yesod, assuming that it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and do you have any proof of that?
Yes, you're right, and that's I think why the Gemara isn't going to be happy with this now. The Gemara is not going to be happy. It's not quite going to give your answer. Your answer is it's a slippery slope. The Gemara is not going to say, well, it's a slippery slope to say that you've forgotten things, because when you reintroduce, you can reintroduce anything on the grounds that it was something that was forgotten. How do we know you're right? But the Gemara is going to provide, as it usually does, an opinion source to show that we don't attribute memory loss, if you like, to the time of the Beis HaMikdash. Interestingly, there is a very similar discussion in the Gemara's elsewhere, which is accepted, which is fascinating, which says that b'yemei Avel shel Moshe Rabbeinu nishtakchi shlosh meos halachos or something. The Gemara says elsewhere that when Moshe Rabbeinu died, the shock of his dying brought about a forgetfulness of some of his statements, and they were reconstructed by Yehoshua and the Zekanim. That actually is already a model on which this statement of Rabbi Zera is built. Yeah. But you can't compare one with the other. You know, the Avelus of Moshe Rabbeinu was at a very early stage. Moshe Rabbeinu just delivered the laws. They hadn't embedded themselves. Over here, we're talking about traditions that embedded themselves for hundreds of years. Now there is a galut, and we somehow say that all that memory becomes evaporates over time, maybe because of lack of use. But the Gemara is not going to be prepared to accept that. Let's see what the Gemara does have as an objection to this. The Gemara says, "Umi of ma Rabbi Yochanan hachi." How can you say, Rabbi Avahu? How can you answer this way that Rabbi Yochanan actually would say that both of them are right? Originally, there was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and with the Golos Bovel that was forgotten, and it needed to be reintroduced as a Yesod Nevi'im at a later stage after they returned from Bovel. Could Rabbi Yochanan actually hold such an opinion? Why shouldn't he? Rabbi Yochanan. Surely Rabbi Yochanan said something very interesting, and it's very interesting. We'll see this in 4 words, and I'm going to spend some time on it. Is it 3 words? 4 words, which mean everything. Read these words. Dilachon Omri, Dilachon He. I said it was yours, but it's theirs. Is that clear enough? Well, you're supposed to understand the Gemara based upon that statement. The Gemara has just explained how Rabbi Yochanan could not say that it had been forgotten in Bovel and rediscovered in Eretz Yisrael, because Rabbi Yochanan made the statement, I thought it was yours, by I see it's theirs. It's not a particularly clear statement. So Rashi comes through with a long explanation, which goes into history and the context in which Rabbi Yochanan is attributed this statement. I thought it was yours, but now I see it is theirs. Now I'm going to share my screen with you. I've forgotten how to share. Oh, here, I remember now. Forgetfulness and Bovel. You see, exile has meant I've even forgotten how to share screen. Let's go back over here. Okay, I've done this. Okay, this is the Rashi. It's on your sheet, but I've just made it bigger for you, so you don't have to try and you don't have to squint. So he's explaining this key statement in the Gemara and telling you what it's all about. Did not Rabbi Yochanan say, Dilachon Omri? I said, Omri means like Omarti, Dilachon, that it is yours, Shalochem, Dilahon he, Shalahem he. That's how you translate Aramaic. So he's now explaining, he's taking us into a story relating to Rav Kahana, and he's going to show how Rabbi Yochanan made a statement in which he was hugely impressed by the Torah of Bovel. So impressed that originally, he admits, he thought the Torah of Eretz Yisrael was the greater of the two. But now, having interviewed the Rav that comes down from Bovel in his time, the time of the early Amorim, he sees it's the other way around. He sees that the Babylonians have maintained traditions and standards of learning in excess of what he finds amongst his contemporaries in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan is the leader of the Talmud Yerushalmi in Eretz Yisrael. So he's through and through a Yerushalmi, if you like. And he meets Rav Kahana, who has run away from Bovel because he fears for his life. And he listens to the teachings of Rav Kahana, and he's bowled over. So let's read the story. Rashi explains how it works. So he says that Rav Kahana, Hoyami Talmidei Rav Kahana was one of the Talmidim of Rav, the great Amora, who was the head of the academy in Surah, in Bovel. And he was very sharp. Uborach le'eretz Yisrael. And he ran away, he fled to Eretz Yisrael, Aleph Yud, Lifnei Rabbi Yochanan, Machamas Mardin. And before, and to learn in front of Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael, because of the persecution, that's really the way you can translate it, Shaharag l'Adam Echad, because he, Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Kahana had killed someone in Bovel. Are you interested in the story behind this murder? This is Talmud and Technicolor. I normally wouldn't go through this. We're just learning. We just say, okay, he killed someone. But it's very interesting. We'll do that story in a moment. How comes Rav Kahana to have murdered someone? But in any case, having murdered someone in Bovel, he had to escape because the Persian authorities had a warrant out with Interpol. So he comes to Eretz Yisrael, and there's no arrangement to deport from Eretz Yisrael. Kidomrin beperek basra de Barbakama. That's where you find the story of the murder. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yochanan found that he could rely on Rav Kahana, who came from Bovel, on many doubts that he had in his learning. And Rabbi Yochanan then said to the Talmidim in Eretz Yisrael, this is really what we said a moment ago. I originally thought that the Torah belongs to you guys in Eretz Yisrael, right? But I thought Dilachon Omri. I originally thought it was yours. I originally thought the Torah was yours. In other words, that you had the superior Torah. Rabbi Yochanan's referring to himself as well, because he's also from Eretz Yisrael. Why? Shelo golisa me'artzachem. Because you have been here all this time without having gone to Golis. In other words, all you who are here today are descended from the lines of scholars that never were taken away so many hundred years ago in Bovel as prisoners. And because you've been here, you were not below Yolachem Tirafadas. You didn't have to go through the mental upheaval and suffering that the Babylonian exile went through. And therefore you should have preserved the Torah in a more pristine state. Avol, Reisi, but now I see, Shehi Shel B'nai Bovel. The Torah really was preserved better in Bovel, dilahon he, as he said, it's theirs, not yours. Sha'af al pi shegolu, even though they were the ones exiled and went through all this trauma, omdolahem chochmas. Now he is referring to a posuk in Malachim. We have to go look through subroutines over here to see what he means. Chochmas ha'cheresh va'masker shekolu im golu yim chonya. What stood for them in Bovel was the wisdom of the artisans that were taken into exile with Yechonia in 586 BC, or whatever, Kidduch Siv, as the Posuk says, Hakol Giborim Oser Milchama. All those people who were taken into exile that went into that first exile in Bovel, they were Giborim Oser Milchama. The Tanya Beseder Olam, and we have a brisa in Seder Olam. What does it mean that these people taken into the exile were Giborim Oser Milchama, that they were? What does it mean? They were mighty soldiers and men of war? That's ridiculous. These people being taken down in chains of iron to Babel. What kind of warriors were these taken from Jerusalem? They were not warriors at all. We sometimes find that Milchama means the battle of Torah, the battle to establish the MS of Torah. We find that in various places. So the people taken down into Bovel were the Talmidei Chachamim. Alma, therefore we see, Severe Leila Rabbi Yochanan, we see Rabbi Yochanan is now of the opinion, having met Rav Kana, the Lo Nishtachad Torah B'Golos Bovel, that when he sees Rav Kana, comes back after this time, he finds that the Torah of Bovel was even greater, even though they went through the turmoil and Bnei Eretz Yisrael didn't. So how that, just coming back to the reason we brought this Gemara here, or Rashi brings it here, it's to prove. You just attributed Rabbi Yochanan saying, well, you know what happened is that when the Bnei Yisrael were taken captive and they went to Bovel and they went through all their trauma, they forgot this Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and it needs to be reinstituted as a Yesod Nevi'im later on. But we just quote Rabbi Yochanan saying that he was bowled over and impressed by the fact that, if anything, they remembered more in Bovel than in Eretz Yisrael. That's what he's saying. So they certainly couldn't have forgotten Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So to say that it started off Moshe Sinai, was forgotten in the Babylonian exile, was re-erected or reconstructed, resuscitated at the time of the coming into Eretz Yisrael, doesn't make sense according to what we understand of Rabbi Yochanan. Just in terms of this passage of Gemara in itself, let me just show you a few very interesting aspects of it. We just quoted here the Rashi said that essentially Rabbi Yochanan says what stood, so to speak, what reinforced the learning of the Babylonians during all their time in exile is that they descended, so to speak, from the Cheresh the Hamasker Shegolu im Yechonia, who were Gibori Ose Milchama. What are this talking about? So here's the verse in the Melachim base. In fact, I've given you two verses here. Here the psukim. It's from the Tanakh. Vayoged is Yo Yochin Bovela. Nebuchadnezzar, he exiled King Yehoiachin to Bovel. The Es Aim Hamelach and his mother, the Es Nishei Hamelach and the wives of Yehoiachin, the Es Arisov, etc., and also his officers. The Es, and here's the important verse, Kol Anshe HaChayil, and also all the men of valor, Shiva Salofim, 7,000 of them, and in yellow, the HaCheresh, the Masker, Elef, 1,000 Cheresh and Masker. Remember, that's what Rashi mentioned, the Cheresh and the Masker. Hakol Giborim Osei Milchama. Vayiviyei Melech Bovel Gola Bovela. And Nebuchadnezzar took them to Bovel to be captive there. So who are the Cheresh v'Hamasker? So the Cheresh and the Masker, literally translated, means something like the craftsmen and the carpenters. All of them mighty makers of war. That's how you translate this. So Chazal never accepted this verse at face value. Several places. The meaning of Cheresh and Masker has been midrashically reinterpreted to mean Talmidei Chachamim. people who are craftsmen and hewers of Torah, if you like, rather than craftsmen and hewers of wood. That's taken to be the classic meaning of this. It's not the first time we see that the Talmud and Medrash uses this. It's not taken as being the craftsmen, the builders at all. And it says, Hakol Giborim Ose Milchama. So what type of war are these people making? And this is why Rashi brought this idea. Rabbi Yochanan said that they were Giborim Ose Milchama. It means they were Milchemta Shel Torah. They battled in Torah, like we've mentioned before. When you go to yeshiva and you see the chavrusas, and they shout at each other because they don't agree with each other how you interpret the particular machlokas in the Gemara. So essentially, when people are arguing over the meaning of the Gemara, as I do over here with you or whoever it is, sometimes we're at war. Of course, we have to make peace before we leave the Zoom, but essentially, we are mentally battling over the meaning of the statement. It means that we are also Giborio se Milchama. It's understood that those are the case. Now, what Rashi is telling us over here is that essentially this first generation that were exiled, because if you look at the Psukim in Lochem, you find there were two exiles. There was an early phase where only a few thousand were taken away. This is what we're talking about over here, the goddess Yehoiachin. And I think something like 11 years later, he comes back and then the whole country is taken out. That's the main goddess Babel. This is what's sometimes called as the goddess HaCherish v'Hamasker, the ones, the 7,000 or 10,000 or whatever people who came up in this first tranche. And they included these extraordinary gifted Talmidei Chachamim. They were taken captive first. The scholar class was taken captive first, if you read it that way. And therefore, this created, if you like, the rump of scholars in Bavel that later was to produce all the Torah scholars later on. That's the way the Gemara is seeing that tradition. And therefore, to some extent, we would understand why the Torah of Bavel was actually greater than the Torah of Eretz Yisrael, because, if you like, the creme de la creme of the Talmidei Chachamim went up with the Cherish v'Hamasker, and they later on produced the generations of scholarship in Bavel. Now, everything you read over here is only quasi-historic. I mean, this is not from an academic journal, obviously, but this is the way the Talmud understands the sequence of Golos and what it might have done in terms of creating a structure of scholarship in Bavel that was in some ways superior to Eretz Yisrael. Now, you find actually in different Gemaras, this is not the only place this is discussed. The Gemara here discusses in other places. How do we compare? The Talmud Bavli discusses, how do we in Bavel compare to the Talmud in Eretz Yisrael? In some places, it suggests that the Talmud of Bavel is greater, and the scholarship is greater and more thorough. And in some places, it seems to say that the Torah of Eretz Yisrael is more pure, because Avira de Eretz Yisrael machkim. No, we say that the atmosphere of Eretz Yisrael that we breathe wisens us. So therefore, we should be the wiser bunch rather than in Bavel. But this is it's a strand of discussion you see in various places. Over here, we're saying that Rabbi Yochanan very much took up the strand, but Bavel in some way were superior, and they would not have forgotten. They would just not have forgotten if it really were Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, would not have had to be reinstituted when they came back from Bavel. It just wouldn't have been necessary. Now I wanted to take you just as a colorful excursion to this story of Rav Kana. We said a moment ago that Rav Kana, he bolted from Bavel. He was in Bavel, and at some point he was involved in some murder, and he had to run away from the Persian authorities. And that's how he got to Eretz Yisrael in the first place. Otherwise, he would have stayed in Bavel. He would never have met Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan would never have been able to say what he said over here. But he fled from Bavel because he was a wanted man. There were posters for him all over Babylon. Why should that have been the case? So there's a Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Kuf Yud Zayin, which is in fact the source that Rashi brings up over here. And what I'm going to do now is we'll read through it together. It's very, very fascinating itself. It's beautiful Gemara, but we'll read it in English, cheating, because it's a long section. And I've taken the translation here from the Sefaria, which I think may be some other translation. I don't even remember which translation it comes from into English, but we'll get through it more quickly rather than me going through the Aramaic and then trying to translate every word. And it's nicely translated here. This tells you the story of Rav Kahana before he had to flee. And he's in Bovel, and there were problems in Bovel with the local authority there, with the secular government, and the Jews had to be very careful. So the story starts like this. There was a certain man, once upon a time, maybe I'll just make it even bigger. There was a certain man who desired to show another individual straw to the Gentile authorities who would seize it. What does that mean? It means somehow there's one guy didn't get on very well with his fellow Jew. And maybe he felt that this other fellow Jew he didn't like very much was smuggling, or he had stolen, or whatever. So he wanted to do an act of Mesira, which he shouldn't do. He wanted to report him to the local police force, which was a Goyisha, Persian police force. And clearly, if he did report him, then the authorities would seize it and maybe kill the perpetrator as well. And he wanted to do that. He wanted to expose his fellow Jew. The story carries on. He came before Rav. Rav was the teacher of Rav Kahana, and who said to him, do not show it and do not show it, i.e. you are absolutely prohibited from showing it. You are not allowed to expose this guy's wrongdoing. It was just whether it was a theft or a smuggling, it's not clear. But if you do, it will produce terrible results to the Jew who owns that. Because they'll come investigating and knocking on his door, and they may take his family away, and who knows what else. But the man said to him, to Rav, I will show it, and I will show it. I will certainly show it. I am going to report this man to the authorities, despite what you say, Rav. Rav Kahana was sitting before Rav, and hearing the man's disrespectful response, the disrespectful response where he says, I will show it, even though you, Rav, say I shouldn't, he dislodged the man's neck from him, he broke his neck and killed him. Right, so he killed the person who was about to be Moisa, his fellow Jew. Seeing Rav Kahana's action, Rav read the following verse about him. The verse isn't important. You know, he shows his Nach expertise. It's from Yeshaya. Your sons have fainted. They lie at the head of all the streets as an antelope in a net. And he said, just as with regard to this antelope, once it falls into the net, the hunter does not have mercy upon it. So too with regard to the money of a Jew. Once it falls into the hand of Gentiles, they do not have mercy upon him, i.e. they kill the Jew. Since Gentiles who seek a Jew's money will kill him in order to seize the property, Rav Kahana acted appropriately when he broke the miscreant's neck, as he protected the Jew's property and by extension, the Jew himself. So Rav Kahana has actually defended, Rav has defended Rav Kahana for killing this Jew, because if he had exposed his fellow Jew to the authorities, that fellow Jew would have been killed. So in a sense, he's trying to save the other man's life. And he saved the other man's life by killing this man. There's a din of rodef. If one person is trying to kill another, you're allowed to kill the person who is trying to kill. And essentially, it follows the din of rodef. So he acted appropriately. So Rav then said to Rav Kahana, until now there were Persian rulers who were not particular about bloodshed, but now there are Greeks who are particular about bloodshed. The Greeks have taken over that part of Persia, and they will say, murder, murder, and they will press charges against you. Therefore get up and ascend to Eretz Yisrael to study there under Rabbi Yochanan, and accept upon yourself that you will not raise any difficulties to the statements of Rabbi Yochanan for 7 years. This is very, very interesting. Anyway, what he said is, get up and go, don't stay, your life is in danger, the Greek authorities will be after you for killing someone, and they'll have your life. Go to Eretz Yisrael, there go and study under the great Rabbi Yochanan. But I'm giving you a bit of an eitzah. We'll go and see what happens in Eretz Yisrael, it's extraordinary. When you're learning under Rabbi Yochanan, don't challenge him on his Torah for 7 years. Can you imagine how much patience that will take? The great Rav Kahana is being told, you're a great scholar. When you get into the yeshiva and you listen to Rabbi Yochanan's drushes, and you feel that there is a question on any of that, you can start asking your questions after 7 years. But for the first 7 years, just buckle down and don't object to what he says. Isn't that remarkable? Okay, let's see whether Rav Kahana has got the Sitzfleisch to sit for 7 years without challenging Rabbi Yochanan. So this is what happened. So Rav Kahana went to Eretz Yisrael and he found Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan were always chavrusas. He finds Reish Lakish, who was sitting and reviewing Rabbi Yochanan's daily lecture in the academy for the rabbis, i.e. the students in the academy. When he finished, Rav Kahana said to the students, "Where is Reish Lakish?" They said to him, "Why do you wish to see him?" Rav Kahana said to them, "I have this difficulty and that difficulty with his review of Rabbi Yochanan's lecture. And I have this resolution and that resolution to the questions he raised." In other words, he was going to challenge some things that Rabbi Yochanan had said. They told this to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was the person who had revised the lecture, so to speak, aloud. Reish Lakish then went and said to Rabbi Yochanan, he hasn't heard Rav Kahana yet. He just knows that Rav Kahana has some very interesting questions and answers. So he goes to his colleague Rabbi Yochanan and says, "A lion has ascended from Babylonia, and the master ought to examine the discourse he will deliver in the academy tomorrow, as Rav Kahana may raise difficult questions about the material." Reish Lakish warns Rabbi Yochanan, there's a Gorn who's just come up from nowhere, from Babylonia, Rav Kahana, who no one has seen before, but he seems to know everything about everything. And Reish Lakish is saying, Rabbi Yochanan, he says, "Prepare yourself very well for tomorrow's shir. It's not going to be easy going, because if Rav Kahana raises some objections with you, you are going to be flustered. So make sure you're well prepared. Right? You're going to have a genius come into your lecture. So be prepared for the questions he's going to throw at you." So what happens the next day? So the next day, they seated Rav Kahana in the first row in front of Rabbi Yochanan. They did that because they were told that he was such a great Gaon and he was going to ask all the important questions. You see, the way they used to seat people was the junior students further behind and the more senior students toward the front. And they felt that he was obviously a senior. Reish Lakish had said so, and he's the second best man here next to Rabbi Yochanan. So they seated Rav Kahana in the front row. He got an expensive ticket, you like. Rabbi Yochanan stated a halacha. Right, he started his speech, and Rav Kahana did not raise a difficulty in accordance with Rav's instruction. He listened to Rav. Rav said, "Don't say anything for 7 years." Anyway, this is day one, mind you. And he sits in the first row, and he's platzing to raise a question, but he doesn't. Rabbi Yochanan stated another halacha, and again Rav Kahana did not raise a difficulty. As a result, they placed Rav Kahana further back by 1 row. This occurred until he had been moved back 7 rows, until he was seated in the last row at the back. Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, "The lion you mentioned has become a fox." He's not knowledgeable. Isn't that cute? So they started off believing Rav Kahana was the senior person. So he was in the front row. Every time he failed to ask in the whole shir, they realized he's not quite as stark as they thought, and they moved him back until he was at the back, which means they'd seated him with the juniors. We have the starters, the office boys, and he was seated there. And Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan prepared himself like anything to meet the most difficult questions, and Rav Kahana threw nothing. The great Rav Kahana threw nothing at him, so maybe the Babylonian scholars don't know anything at all. Anyway, Rav Kahana said to himself, this is really cute. He said, "May it be God's will that these 7 rows I have been moved should replace the 7 years that Rav told me to wait before raising difficulties to the statement of Rabbi Yochanan." This is it. He couldn't wait 7 years, but he's saying, you know what? Why did Rav ask me to wait 7 years? He wanted me to show my humility and not immediately. I'm coming from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yochanan is the head of the Yerushalayim of the academy in Eretz Yisrael. Not actually in Yerushalayim, it was in Tiberia, but it was the Eretz Yisrael Academy. And I'm going to challenge him straight away. That won't be fair. I have to wait 7 years to show that I'm learning with him. However, I've just been through 7 humiliations. I started off in the first row, and I quietly waited until I reached the back row. And I think, therefore, I've had the Yisurim, the punishment, the trauma that 7 years would have brought, I've already gone through in 7 days. So it's now time for me to raise questions. So he stood up on his feet and he said to Rabbi Yochanan, let the master go back to the beginning of the discourse, the shir. Can you start the shir all over again and repeat what you said? So Rabbi Yochanan started the beginning, stated the halacha, and Rav Kahana raised the difficulty. Therefore, they placed him back in the first row. And again, Rabbi Yochanan stated halacha, and he raised the difficulty. So they promoted him again, because he accepted being moved to the back, and the administrators moved him to the front row again. But he was in the front row, and he was still challenging. So they can't move him any further forward, can they? So now the Gemara says something very interesting. Rabbi Yochanan was sitting upon 7 cushions so that he could be seen by all the students. Yeah, so he was like on a pedestal, and all the students were sitting on the floor. And since he could not answer Rav Kahana's questions, he removed 1 cushion from under himself to demonstrate that he was lowering himself out of respect for Rav Kahana. He then stated another halacha, and Rav Kahana raised another difficulty. This happened repeatedly until Rabbi Yochanan moved all the cushions from underneath himself until he was sitting on the ground. End of the story. Isn't that a beautiful story? I mean, of all stories, it's one of the most gorgeous Gemara stories ever heard. He was re-promoted, but not only that, Rabbi Yochanan was such an honor that each time he lowered his cushion in deference to Rav Kahana, who was throwing all these difficult questions on him. Anyway, we've been through a little bit of a wild goose chase over here. The real object of all these stories was to show that Rav Kahana, who represented the Torah of Bovel, was in some ways considered to be superior to the Talmudim in Eretz Yisrael. And if that's the case, this idea that the same Rabbi Yochanan, who was so deferential to Rav Kahana, would also say that in Bovel they forgot all the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, or many halachas, and this one of Arava, and it needed later on to be reconstructed. It just doesn't hold water. That's what Gemara wants to say over here, because it seems that the halachas, everything was remembered very well by the Talmudim in Bovel. So then again comes back the question. How can Rabbi Yochanan have said on the one hand that it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and yet on the other hand, we say that he said that it was a Yesod Nevi'im? That question comes back again. You can't answer that it started off as A and it moved to B. We have a clash. So the Gemara answers, and we'll stop at this point. Lo kasha. We can say it's not a kasha. Kan ba mikdash, kan bigvulin. That it depends where. It was both, but it was differentially one or the other in different places. When we say it was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, that statement of Rabbi Yochanan, that is when he was referring to the time, he was referring to the Beis HaMikdash itself. He was referring to the Beis HaMikdash. It was halacha l'Moshe Sinai that it should be done in the Beis HaMikdash. That carried the Torah force of halacha l'Moshe Sinai. However, there was no halacha l'Moshe Sinai that this Arava ceremony should be done outside the Beis HaMikdash, in this idea of taking one similar to the one and walking around 7 times on Hoshana Rabbah, for example. That was not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That was a Yesod Nevi'im. So you've got, essentially, we divided the mitzvah into 2 parts this way. There was halacha l'Moshe Sinai, but that was only the temple ceremony, and that carried Torah force. However, Nevi'im, later on, when they came into Eretz Yisrael, they instituted something stronger than a minute, Yesod Nevi'im, according to this view of Rabbi Yochanan, that it should be taken by other people as well, outside the Beis HaMikdash, as a Yesod Nevi'im, which has the force of a Drabanan, and which has come through, if you like, in the pale ceremony we have on Hoshana Rabbah, where we take just the Arabot without the Lulav and Esrog, and we do Hakofot. That bit would be the Yesod Nevi'im, whereas the ceremony in the Beis HaMikdash would be the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Okay, I'm going to stop recording. Where do I stop